May 31st, 1964, Charles Schmid would take Aline Rowe into the desert, where he proceeded to rape her before brutally bludgeoning her to death. However, the cost of his crime became the heaviest price to pay: death. Here are 10 serial killers who were instantly killed in jail.
The Gaff Strangler, a look back at the terror that was happening 55 years ago. Our Ashley Garrett details the Black History exhibit 1968, the year that shocked the nation.
May 20th, 1967, Leroy Martin strangled and raped Annie Lucille Dedman, leaving her husband Roger Dedman to take the fall. However, it was his overconfidence that led to his downfall and eventual demise. Born in 1937 in Gaffney, Martin led what seemed like a typical life on the surface. He was married, had some children, and worked as a textile mill employee. However, beneath this ordinary facade lay a darker, more sinister side that would soon reveal itself. Martin's descent into infamy began in 1967 when he started a killing spree that would shock the quiet town of Gaffney and beyond. His first known victim was 20-year-old Nancy Carroll Paris, whom he abducted, assaulted, and strangled. After killing Paris, Martin buried her body in a secluded area. And for a time, her disappearance went unsolved, and Martin carried on like nothing had happened. Martin's desires wouldn't stop here though. Emboldened by his ability to evade capture, he killed 3 more women over the next few months. The victims, each abducted, assaulted, and strangled, which included Nancy Christine Reinhardt, 32-year-old Annie Lucille Dedman, whose husband was initially convicted for her murder, and Opal Diane Buxton. The brutal nature of these crimes sent shockwaves throughout the community, and the press dubbed him the Gaff Strangler. What made Martin even more terrifying was his twisted need for recognition. He began taunting local authorities and newspapers by sending anonymous letters, detailing where the bodies of his victims could be found. These letters not only revealed his desire to be known, but also demonstrated his arrogance, believing that he was untouchable. However, Martin got too cocky. In one of his letters, he provided enough information for law enforcement to narrow down their search. The police eventually tracked him down, and on February 27, 1968, Martin was eventually arrested. His capture brought a sense of relief to Gaffney, a town that had been living in fear for months. During his trial, Martin confessed to everything and was sentenced to life in prison. Yet his story doesn't end with his imprisonment. In a twist that shocked many, 1972, Martin is fatally stabbed by fellow inmate Kenneth Rumsey at Central Correctional Institution in South Carolina, just 4 years after being imprisoned. Interestingly, 5 years after his death, Rumsey took his own life by hanging himself in his cell.
I know a guy who buys a girl. Hell, I know 5 or 6 of them that would buy a girl and make her into a whore. I mean, this is nothing new.
Gerard John Schaefer, a name that sends chills down my spine. This guy was a Florida police officer who turned into one of the most notorious serial killers in America's history. Born on March 26, 1946, in Neenah, Wisconsin, Schaefer's early life was pretty normal. But underneath, there were some disturbing signs. He was known to have a dark fascination with violence and control from a young age, often engaging in disturbing fantasies involving the torture and murder of women. Schaefer's journey into law enforcement in the late 70s might have seemed like a path to power and authority, but it was really to cover his sick, twisted desires. Now, first he worked as a teacher, but quickly he would find his way into the force. And becoming a deputy sheriff in Martin County, Florida, would be the perfect position for him to indulge in his dark fantasies, under the guise of protecting the public. Now, his double life would begin to unravel in July 1972, when he abducted 2 girls, Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter, while on duty. Schaefer took them to a remote area, tied them to a tree, and left them there, intending to return later for more sadistic acts. However, the girls had managed to escape and reported the incident, leading to Schaefer's arrest. At the time, he downplayed the situation, claiming it was a misguided attempt to scare the girls straight. He was convicted of false imprisonment and assault, losing his job and being sentenced to a year in prison. But that would be the tip of the iceberg. because while Schaefer was in prison, a search of his house revealed a treasure trove of evidence, linking him to several disappearances and murders. Diaries, personal belongings of missing women, and strange stories detailing all his fantasies and crimes were discovered. Investigators linked him to at least 2 murders, those of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, whose bodies were found in a remote area after being reported missing. Now, despite this overwhelming evidence, Schaefer was convicted of only 2 murders in 1973, but sentenced to life in prison nonetheless. However, authorities believe he was responsible for the deaths of up to 30 women. Schaefer's crimes were marked by extreme brutality and sadism, earning him a place amongst the most terrifying killers in history. And in December 1995, Schaefer met a violent end when fellow inmate Vincent Rivera fatally stabbed him, seemingly without motive. Now, his death may have brought closure to some, but the true extent of his crimes remains a haunting mystery. June 1984, Mark Tildesley was abducted, drugged, tortured, raped, and murdered by a London-based pedophile gang with Leslie Bailey as the chief perpetrator. However, it wasn't until this ongoing investigation in 1991 that the heinous crime was discovered, with the most vicious form of justice awaiting Leslie Bailey. Born in 1953 in England, Bailey's early life isn't one that's well documented, but it is clear that she had become entangled in the dark world of criminal activities, more specifically in connection with the notorious group known as the Dirty Dozen. This gang was involved in a series of heinous crimes, including sexual assaults and murders, particularly against vulnerable children. Bailey's crimes came to light in the late 80s when she was implicated in the murders of 3 boys, Mark Tildesley, Jason Swift, and Barry Lewis. Now, these murders were part of what became known as the House of Horrors case, a chilling series of events that really shocked the nation. The gang, including Bailey, would lure these boys with promises of treats or money, only to subject them to horrific abuse before ultimately killing them. Bailey played a significant role in these crimes, acting alongside other members of this gang. His involvement wasn't just passive, he was actively engaging in this abuse, and was directly responsible for the deaths of at least 2 of the boys. Bailey's trial revealed the extent of his depravity, and in 1989 he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for his role in those murders. However, of course, it doesn't end with his conviction, because in a twist that almost seemed inevitable, Bailey was murdered in his prison cell in 1993. Fellow inmates would take justice into their own hands, beating him to death. Many would see this death as a very grim form of retribution. May 31, 1964. Charles Schmid, with the help of his then-girlfriend, Mary Flench, lured Aline Rowe to a desert, after which he would rape and bludgeon her to death. And this was one of 3 known murders he gruesomely carried out. However, it would be his best friend that led to his eventual downfall. Born on July 8, 1942, in Tucson, Arizona, Schmid grew up feeling inadequate and insecure, despite being adopted into a well-off family. So to compensate, he crafted a persona that was hard to miss. He wore makeup, stuffed his boots with crushed cans to appear taller, and took on Elvis Presley's hairstyle, which earned him a following amongst local teenagers. Schmid was more than just a local celebrity. He exuded a dark charm that attracted a group of young, impressionable followers who were just mesmerized by his rebellious attitude and seemingly larger-than-life persona. However, we'll come to know that this deeply disturbed individual was really craving for power and control, and would try to satisfy his urges in the most horrific ways. In 1964, Schmid's dark side took a lethal turn. He murdered 15-year-old Aline Rowe, luring her out to the desert with the promise of a party, only to rape and brutally bludgeon her, after which he buried her. Now, what's chilling is that he bragged about this to his friends, who in turn did nothing to stop him, and his twisted sense of invincibility only fueled his desire to kill again. In 1965, he struck again, this time targeting his girlfriend, Gretchen Fritz, and her younger sister, Wendy. Gretchen had discovered Schmid's involvement in Aline's murder and threatened to expose him. To silence her, he strangled both sisters and buried their bodies in the desert. This guy was sick. He even took his friends to the burial site, where he bragged about his actions. Despite his arrogance, Schmid's reign of terror began to crumble as his friends' fear turned into guilt. His close friend, Richard Bruns, eventually went to the police after fearing for his own life, and that led to Schmid's arrest in 1965. The case shocked the nation, exposing not only Schmid's crimes, but also the disturbing willingness of his followers to keep his secrets. Consequently, Schmid was convicted of all 3 murders and sentenced to death, which later commuted to 50 years in prison when the death penalty was temporarily abolished in the 70s. And now in prison, he couldn't escape his notoriety, as on March 20th, 1975, he was attacked and stabbed 47 times by fellow inmates Jimmy Farah and Dennis Eversole, leading to his death a few days later.
The notorious Boston crime boss James Whitey Bulger is dead, one day after being transferred to a federal prison in West Virginia.
James Whitey Bulger, one of the most notorious figures in American crime history, was involved in murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and extortion. However, what made him a special crime boss was his secret weapon. This guy was a CI for the FBI. Born September 3, 1929, in Boston, Massachusetts, Bulger grew up in the tough neighborhood of South Boston, or Southie as it's known. From a young age, he would show signs of trouble, quickly getting involved in petty crime, which eventually escalated into more serious criminal activities. By the 1970s, Bulger had become a significant player in Boston's underworld, leading the Winter Hill Gang, a predominantly Irish-American group. Now, his rise to power wasn't all just brute force. This guy was incredibly cunning, with an ace up his sleeve that made him nearly untouchable. Starting in 1975, he became an informant, feeding the CIA information about his rivals in exchange for protection and immunity. This relationship allowed him to eliminate his competition while continuing to build his criminal empire, which now included drug trafficking, extortion, and murder. But Bulger wasn't just any crime boss. This guy was a master manipulator who can use the FBI's connections to stay one step ahead of the law. The agent handling him, John Connolly, was also from South Boston and shared a deep connection with Bulger, which made that relationship even more complex and corrupt. Connolly's protection allowed Bulger to operate with impunity for years, even as all those bodies were piling up. However, in 1994, things started to unravel. The FBI's internal investigations into corruption began to close in, and Bulger received a tip-off from Connolly that his arrest was imminent. Bulger fled Boston and disappeared, sparking one of the most extensive manhunts in U.S. history. For 16 years he evaded capture, becoming a fixture on the FBI's Most Wanted, right behind Osama bin Laden at some point. In 2011, Bulger's time on the run came to a close when he was arrested in Santa Monica, California, where he'd been living with his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Grieg, using a false identity. His arrest was a huge media event, bringing a close to a dark chapter in Boston's history. In 2013, Bulger was convicted of 31 charges, including 11 murders, and was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years. But even in prison, his story wouldn't end quietly, as on October 30th, 2018, at the age of 89, after being moved from the Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma to the U.S. Penitentiary at Hazleton, West Virginia, he was violently killed by other inmates within 12 hours of his arrival. This guy was beaten to death with a padlock stuffed inside a sock by Fotios Gaius, who received a 25-year prison sentence for his murder. A grim and violent end to a life steeped in crime. 1976 to 77. Serial killer Thor Christensen made female students a target at the University of California in Santa Barbara, killing them in ways that would really shock the nation. However, it was the escape of his 5th intended victim that took him to the path of no return. Born December 28, 1957 in Denmark, Thor would move with his family to Solvang, a small Danish-themed town in California, when he was young. Now, what looked like an ordinary teenager was actually a troubled young man struggling with some deep-seated issues. As a teenager, Thor was socially awkward and had difficulty fitting in. He struggled with his weight and self-esteem, which only fueled a growing resentment towards women. And these insecurities gradually evolved into violent fantasies that he would later act upon in the most horrific way. Thor's descent into murder began in 1976 when he was just 19 years old. His first known victim was 21-year-old Isla Vista student Jacqueline Rook, whom he picked up while she was hitchhiking. Thor shot her in the head and just left her body in a remote area. This gruesome act would mark only the beginning of a series of murders targeting young women in the Santa Barbara area, all of whom were also shot in the head while hitchhiking. Now, these poor young women would trust him enough to accept a ride, not knowing the dark intentions lurking behind his seemingly harmless demeanor. In 1977, Thor would kill Mary Ann Saris and Patricia Laney, both students at the University of California, Santa Barbara. The murders sent waves of fear through the community, as women were warned not to hitchhike or accept rides from strangers. But despite this growing fear, Thor continued his spree. His method was chillingly consistent. Pick up a hitchhiker, shoot her in the head, dump the body. It wasn't until April 1979 that Thor made a crucial mistake and his reign of terror came to an end. That month, he picked up 24-year-old Lydia Preston, who also fell victim to his twisted routine. However, despite being shot in the head, Lydia miraculously survived. She had the brainpower to provide a description of her assailant to the police. Thor's capture came when Lydia spotted him at a bar in LA and told authorities. Her bravery in coming forward was instrumental in ending Thor's killing spree. Mr. Christensen was arrested and eventually confessed to the murders of 4 women, though he was suspected of many more. In 1980, he was given life in a max security prison without the possibility of parole. But his life behind bars, of course, was short-lived because in 1981, this guy was stabbed to death while walking in the exercise yard at Folsom State Prison by a fellow inmate whose identity still remains unknown. Donald Harvey, one of the many angels of death, was an orderly who took advantage of his position to commit horrific murders, making him one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Born April 15, 1952, in Butler County, Ohio, Harvey's life began on an unremarkable note. However, by the time he was apprehended in 1987, he had claimed the lives of at least 37 people, though some put that figure as high as 87. Now, we know his killing spree began in the early 1970s when he was employed at the Marymount Hospital in Kentucky. Initially, he claimed that his actions were merciful, ending the suffering of terminally ill patients. But as the killing continued, it became clear that his motivations were far more sinister. Harvey would use a variety of methods, including poisoning with cyanide and arsenic, suffocation, and even deliberate administration of harmful doses of other medication. Now, his crimes went undetected for years, partly due to his unassuming demeanor and the trust placed in him by his colleagues. He would move from one medical facility to another, continuing his killings at the Cincinnati VA Medical Center and other hospitals. Harvey even managed to kill people outside the hospital too, and killed a neighbor and his own lover, using his skills and knowledge as a healthcare professional to cover his tracks. Harvey's downfall began when he was working at the Cincinnati VA Medical Center. There was a pattern of suspicious deaths that caught the attention of hospital staff, which led to an investigation. In 1987, a series of autopsies revealed traces of cyanide in a patient's body. Harvey was arrested, and under questioning, he confessed to killing dozens of patients over a 17-year period. The public and the media were shocked by Harvey's confessions, which really revealed the horrifying extent of his actions. Now, he said that many of his victims were elderly or were suffering from a terminal illness as justification for these murders. However, it became evident that he often killed out of anger, revenge, or simply because he could. In August 1987, he pled guilty to 24 counts of murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of felonious assault, amongst other charges. He was given multiple life terms in prison, where he remained until he was found severely beaten in his cell on March 28, 2017 by fellow inmate James Elliott at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Ohio. This guy succumbed to his injuries 2 days later, bringing an end to the life of a man who had terrorized the most vulnerable members of society under the guise of care. December 18, 1984. An Ecuadorian girl was abducted by Daniel Kamodo Barbosa. This would be the first of 72 other murders in Ecuador alone, and he would set the pace as one of South America's most notorious serial killers, a man whose crimes spread terror across 2 countries and left a trail of devastation that still haunts the memory of many. Born January 22, 1930 in Colombia, Kamodo's early life was marred by hardship and abuse. His mother died when he was young, and his father was strict and cold. His troubled childhood set the stage for his unimaginable crime spree. His criminal activities would begin, like many, with petty thievery, but it wasn't long before his actions escalated. By the 80s, he was convicted for raping and murdering a girl in Colombia. However, he escaped the death penalty due to Colombia's lenient laws at that time, and was sentenced to prison life instead. During his time in jail, he met a woman named Alcida, who was said to have influenced his behavior positively, which led to an early release on good behavior after just a few years. Unfortunately, that release was a very big mistake, starting a horrific chapter in his life. After getting out of there, he relocated to Ecuador, where he embarked on a killing spree that would claim the lives of over 150 girls. His method was so chillingly consistent. He would lure his victims with the promise of gifts or employment, lead them into isolated areas, and then assault and strangle them. Kamodo's murders were marked by a calculated coldness, and he often chose his victims from impoverished backgrounds, believing they would be less likely to attract media attention or a police response. Kamodo managed to evade capture for years, largely because of the fear and confusion his crimes generated. With meticulous planning and the ability to blend in with the local population, it was difficult for law enforcement to catch him. However, in 1986, Kamodo was finally caught in Quito, Ecuador, after being found with a girl's bloody clothing. He did confess to the murders, claiming to have killed around 72 girls in Ecuador alone, though the true number is believed to obviously be much higher. Kamodo was sentenced to 16 years in prison, the max penalty under Ecuadorian law at the time. And despite the severity of his crimes, this light sentence sparked outrage. But karma has a funny way of coming around. When he was murdered by another inmate, Giovanni Noguera, who was actually a nephew of one of his victims in 1994. This death was seen as a very fitting end to a life filled with unimaginable cruelty. May 5, 1963. Leopold Dion crossed paths with Alan Carrier and Michael Morrill, whom he cunningly and brutally murdered. However, these are just 2 of the 4 boys that he killed, and that's alongside the 21 boys he actually molested. Crimes that cleared the road to his eventual demise. Born February 25, 1920, Dion's criminal career would begin with minor offenses like theft and fraud, leading to multiple incarcerations. However, it was during these stints in prison that his darker impulses began to surface. After his release in 1960, Dion posed as a photographer to lure boys into isolated areas, under the pretense of taking their pictures, and once alone he would assault and eventually murder his victims. In the span of just a few months in 1963, Dion brutally assaulted and murdered 4 boys in the Quebec City area. His method involved strangulation, and he would often bury the bodies in remote areas. The crime sent waves of fear throughout the whole region, with parents becoming increasingly anxious about their own children's safety. Now, Dion was finally apprehended after one of his would-be victims managed to escape and alert the authorities. This young boy's bravery provided the critical lead that police needed to track down Dion. Upon his arrest and after a month in prison, Dion confessed to the murders and even led police to the burial sites. The case had significant media attention, with the public and press condemning Dion for his heinous actions. The trial that followed was swift, with Dion being found guilty and sentenced to death. His case also reignited debates about capital punishment in Canada, a country that was gradually moving away from the death penalty. However, before his execution could take place, Dion's sentence was commuted to life in prison due to the abolitionist sentiment growing within the Canadian justice system. But Dion's life was still violently cut short on November 17, 1972, when he was attacked and killed by fellow inmate Norman Champagne, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, who was later acquitted of that due to insanity in Quebec's St. Vincent de Paul prison. Albert DSalvo, the man who earned the moniker Boston Strangler, a name that many remember, and those who are familiar will remember the gruesome murders that terrorized Boston in the early 60s. Born September 3, 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, DSalvo's early life was troubled, marked by an abusive father, and also a life of petty crime that started at a young age. By the time the Boston Strangler murders began in 1962, DSalvo was already well acquainted with the law. However, the crimes that would make him infamous were far more sinister than the minor theft and burglary that dotted his criminal record. Over the course of 2 years, 1962 to 64, 13 women, ranging from 19 to 85 years of age, were brutally strangled in their homes. The killer would often gain entry by posing as a maintenance worker, or maybe just using his charm to gain the trust of his victims. The murders had a distinct pattern. The women were sexually assaulted and strangled with their own stockings. The city of Boston was gripped by fear. The police were under immense pressure to find this guy. However, despite extensive investigations, the Boston Strangler remained elusive. DSalvo was eventually arrested in 1964, but not for the Strangler murders. He'd been apprehended for a series of sexual assaults and break-ins known as the Green Man attacks, where he posed as a handyman to gain access to women's homes. It was during his time in custody that DSalvo allegedly confessed to being the Boston Strangler, recounting details of the murders that only the killer would know. However, there was no physical evidence linking him to the crimes, and his confession was called into question due to his history of fabrications and mental instability. Now, in 1967, DSalvo was convicted of the Green Man crimes and sentenced to life in prison. Despite his confession, many remain skeptical about his guilt in the Strangler murders. The case was further complicated, with experts believing that there may have been more than one killer. Either way, DSalvo's life came to a violent end on November 25, 1973, when he was stabbed to death by an unknown assailant in the max security Walpole State Prison. His death only deepened the mystery surrounding the Boston Strangler case, but in a surprising twist, DNA evidence in 2013 linked DSalvo to the murder of Mary Sullivan, one of the Strangler's victims, thus providing some closure to a case that had haunted Boston for decades. However, questions still linger about whether DSalvo was truly responsible for all the murders attributed to the Boston Strangler, leaving his legacy shrouded in ambiguity and fear.